We need Greenland for national security and even international security. And I think we're going to get it. One way or the other, we're going to get it.
Everyone knows the president has his eye on Greenland, but he's not alone. China has secretly been poking around for even longer. But turn the globe. Why would China, nowhere near the Arctic, be hugely invested, even threatened, when Greenlanders slow their projects down? Greenland's is a quiet but utterly consequential political showdown, a drama that secretly peaked in the last few days. Our first character is Greenland, and you're probably already asking, if not for the billions of estimated barrels of untapped oil, trillions of cubic feet of natural gas, if not for melting ice, opening shipping lanes, or strategic placement for military bases, monitoring sea traffic and scanning for missiles. My imaginary producer wants me to take a little bit of a breath. If not for all those things, what are people after in Greenland? Well, they do want those things, but more than anything else right now, great powers want access to rare earth elements and critical minerals. These are the substances necessary for the production of the technologies of the future. They're found in cutting-edge chips, computers, smart devices, solar panels, electric vehicles, wind turbines, new weapons, defense equipment, and medical supplies. I hugged these sources to compile that list. Everyone needs these critical minerals and rare earths. Therefore, their value has been skyrocketing since 2020. Demand is expected to at least double by 2035. By then, value might decuple. That's pretentious for multiply by 10. That's where Greenland comes into the picture. The world's largest island, 800,000 square miles, 2 million square kilometers, is home to only 60,000 people. And as we'll see, people who have long wanted to control their own destinies. Therefore, the global race for rare earth elements and critical minerals poses huge risk and reward for Greenlanders. That's because at least hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of metric tons are found here. Greenland is home to perhaps a quarter, more likely a fifth, of the global reserves of rare earth elements. Quoting Otto Svensson for CSIS, the territory contains 39 of the 50 minerals deemed critical to U.S. national security and economic stability, and that U.S. list naturally has lots of overlap with other major powers. So you can see why this would bring outside attention to Greenland, why everyone wants a piece. And Greenland hasn't exactly resisted the attention. It's useful. Like I alluded to, Greenlanders have long wanted to control their own destinies. The mostly Inuit island was subject to Danish colonial settlement, followed by Danish control until granted home rule in the 1970s. As of 2009, Greenland is mostly self-governing, though the Kingdom of Denmark still handles monetary policy, foreign policy, and defense. Here's the Act on Greenland Self-Government. It says Greenland can negotiate its independence from Denmark if the people of Greenland take a decision in favor of independence. But though 70 to 84% of Greenlanders want independence, it hasn't yet been achieved. What holds Greenland to Denmark, mostly, is money. About 600 million comes from Denmark each year to buoy Greenland's public coffers. If Greenlanders could find a way to fund their complete governance, including defense, the appetite for independence is voracious. So we have this quasi-independent country in search of a solid source of cash, and we have global demand for a set of resources that quasi-independent country happens to have in droves. Seems like a sweet deal in the making. A country with the right know-how, enough people could come in, extract, Greenland could profit. There's only one problem. Until recently, basically everyone was sleeping on Greenland. Later we'll touch on just how embarrassingly asleep some were. But one country was not snoozing, not at all. They're the next character in our story. They saw Greenland as critical, and they saw it early. Let's talk about China. About 80% of Greenland is in the Arctic Circle. Now, if you squint at this map I'm putting up, the eagle-eyed among you may notice that 0% of China is in the Arctic Circle. China's nowhere near Greenland, nowhere near the Arctic. But someone forgot to tell China that. China became involved in scientific Arctic committees in the 1990s, then held its first Arctic expedition in 1999. It opened a research station in 2004, became a temporary observer of the multinational Arctic Council in 2007, and finally a permanent observer in 2013, the same year Xi Jinping came to power. And in theory, great. Scientific idealism, come one, come all, cooperate. But let's be real, we all know that countries have multiple interests when they engage in a region like the Arctic, and it's not all benevolent. Powers like the US and Russia were skeptical of China's scientific pretenses, sensing that the fledgling superpower was posturing for future leverage. Indeed, a paper I read on these early years called China's Arctic Strategy Presence Before Power. So they show up, play by the international rules, engage with the powers with actual Arctic territory, and then one day, flex. And one opening for Chinese presence in the Arctic was Greenland, a place loaded with untapped resources, a country looking for partners to weaken dependence on Danish finance. 2013, the same year China became a permanent observer of the Arctic Council, officials and investors were exchanged between China and Greenland. Months later, Greenland's parliament retracted a ban on uranium mining, in place since the 1950s, effectively an open invitation for a slate of Chinese projects. So here's a map of the initiatives I found between 2013 and 2018 in my research. A few points represent purchase stakes in mineral and rare earth element mining. There are also attempts at airports, energy infrastructure, the purchase of a naval base, and a satellite monitoring station. 2018 was when China decided to shed some of the pretense, labeling itself in a white paper as a near-Arctic state after announcing plans for a so-called polar Silk Road. What is a near-Arctic state, you might ask? Nobody really knows. One author I read quipped that China's, quote, northernmost provincial capital, Harbin, is on the same latitude as Venice. It made me wonder how a Venetian gondola would fare in Arctic waters. Former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo was more confrontational.
Beijing claims to be a near-Arctic state, yet the shortest distance between China and the Arctic is 900 miles. There are only Arctic states and non-Arctic states. No third category exists, and claiming otherwise entitles China to exactly nothing.
But I believe this antagonism was actually anxiety in an aggressive costume, which actually is a great way to describe our next character. A bit of a caricature of themselves, they snooze through Act 1 just to awaken and go straight to an 11 of 10. Please welcome to the stage the United States of America. Now, must be said, it's a bit of a cliche, a trope to pose the Chinese as the patient manipulators and the Americans as the bumbling aggressors who show up late and go all out, but, well, this is nonfiction. I can't really change the story. Of course, the US is an Arctic state because of Alaska, is involved through NATO and through territorial dispute with Canada, but it's fairly astounding to research over a decade of American magazine pieces, books, congressional reports, think tank articles, and see relatively little attention for Arctic critical minerals and rare earth elements. In fact, the recent 2024 edition of a 100-page congressional report on the Arctic only mentions rare earth elements 3 times. US leadership was starting from a standing position. There are 3 steps here to consider. First, mine the mineral or element. Second, process it so it can be used in step 3, manufacture defense equipment and green tech. China has dominance on step 1, mining of rare earths. My sources provide a few different numbers depending on year and calculation, but China has an overwhelming advantage on rare earth mining around the world, responsible for something like 60 to 80% of production. It gets more extreme for step 2. China refines 87% of rare earths, 90 to 100% of heavy rare earths used for, quote, various high-tech applications, including electric vehicles and fighter jets. So I think you can see where the problem is. If China controls step 1 and 2, the mining and the refining, then they obviously have control over step 3, the manufacturing of these strategic technologies. And we will see that very recently China turned down the knob on the West and panicked quite a few companies and politicians. But before that, the US emerged from its slumber in about 2017. That's when the president put out Executive Order 13817, which began by acknowledging the United States is heavily reliant on imports of certain mineral commodities. This dependency of the United States on foreign sources creates a strategic vulnerability. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first man-made Earth satellite. It caused panic that the US had become complacent, fallen behind surging Soviet scientific prowess. In our time, I believe the realization that China had developed a near monopoly on the entire supply chain for rare earths will be looked back upon as one of the modern Sputnik moments for the United States. A moment when a comfortable power looked up and realized it was falling behind on something scientific and essential. And as you probably already know, American leadership did not take that realization well. Now that we have our three main characters on the stage, it's time to see how they interact. This is an ongoing story, but some of the recent developments have left me genuinely shocked, just showing how important Greenland could be to the US and China. It was not a coincidence that shortly after admitting a strategic vulnerability on certain mineral commodities, President Trump first floated the idea of buying Greenland. Someone must have told him the resources in Greenland were desperately needed and that China had been winning there for a long time. Therefore, it might be the right moment to revive American territorial ambition not seen since the Spanish-American War. While the impulse to buy Greenland was laughed at in 2019, things have gotten more ominous in Trump's second term as the implicit threat of military action has come to the fore. You know, we're gonna get it one way or the other. The stakes have been raised extremely quickly. But Greenlanders have not been passive recipients of American attention, nor Chinese attention for that matter. They want their independence, but not at any cost. They've verbally rejected American efforts to buy them. Polling shows overwhelming opposition to becoming part of the United States. Playing these powers off one another might be a useful maneuver towards independence, but not if any one gains dominance over critical infrastructure or a stranglehold on economic prosperity. But like I said, this goes for China too. China's activity have been slowed. Licenses stripped, uranium mining rebanned, investments blocked. Some of that's been Danish and American meddling, but much has been local opposition by Greenlanders themselves, as there is concern for China's adherence to environmental standards and labor conditions. A good book to read if you're interested in just how amoral and devastating China's behavior can be when extracting resources. This incredible journalism on China's cobalt mining in the Congo. So at this time in other theaters, the US and China were sparring. Tariffs during Trump's first term and the Biden administration left relations icy. The US passed the CHIPS Act in 2022, implementing export restrictions on advanced chips to Beijing. In response, China began restricting exports on minerals used in semiconductor production and on rare earth processing technology. But the real swing started flying after April 2025 Liberation Day, the day President Trump imposed new import taxes for every territory on Earth, but particularly, and most especially, on imports from China. So China hit back with export restrictions, licensing for 7 heavy rare earth elements, the ones for which they had a monopoly on refining. They coupled this with export controls for 15 American defense and aerospace companies. So let's be clear, in response to Trump's import tariffs, the Chinese were cutting off some of the substances necessary for the creation, manufacture of the military-industrial complex in the United States. A Sputnik moment. Muad'Dib threatens the spice. I don't think it's an exaggeration. Just like the USA has a financial monopoly, they can impose financial sanctions at will on the international community in a way really no other country can. China, we've recently learned, not only has a monopoly on rare earth elements and critical minerals, but they're willing to just turn down that knob and see if the West panics. A quote that really stuck out to me on this, a researcher told the Financial Times, the balance of leverage is shifting fast in China's favor, a fact that the Trump team has only barely begun to recognize. This is what shocked me. Okay, sure, anyone following the news knew that China retaliated to Liberation Day. They might have heard about some export controls, but at least for me, the impact of that action got lost in all the noise. Supply chain traffic jams started immediately. US manufacturers began shutting down operations due to rare earth shortages. And it wasn't just the defense industry. The American auto industry suffered in particular, with manufacturing pauses, even layoffs. So if you're curious why Trump kept negotiating this China tariff number down on his social media platform all by his lonesome, I think this is it. China had a lot more leverage than US leadership would like to admit, a leverage they'd like to maintain. Which brings us on to the road back, where our journey began with our protagonist, Greenland. The island's minerals and rare earths were seen early on by China as a means by which to help secure their dominance in mining and refining. A dominance they'd like to maintain. A dominance they just used to great effect. But nowadays, Greenland has experienced change. They potentially want extraction, but on their own terms. The US government has experienced change, finally awakened and acting in ways both strategic and kinda stupid. The US hasn't only clumsily threatened invasion to get hold of Greenland's resources, US defense contractors are looking for an investment interest into Greenland's mining, while the US government sends aid money to help advance Greenland's mining industry. The US Export-Import Bank even offered a loan of $120 million for rare earth mining in southern Greenland. Even the European Union has joined the party, albeit super late. They just won a 30-year contract to mine a critical aerospace mineral, enough to cover roughly a quarter of their needs. And all this new Western activity is why for China, a country nowhere near the Arctic, Greenland slowing or pulling the plug on their mining projects was a great threat. Their gradual expulsion from Greenland and the North American Arctic a setback for their monopoly. Chinese academics express concern that the West is tipping the Arctic scales against Beijing. Russia's ostracization after invading Ukraine and the suspension of the Arctic Council means that NATO countries are running the northern show, threatening China's Arctic foothold in Greenland. Greenland is a threat because it represents the ability of the West to rebound after missing the mark, its ability to play catch-up, to mitigate China's global leverage over critical minerals and rare earths, a path to a comeback in Act 3. Greenland holds the keys of fate for defense and future tech, an island of less than 60,000 people, a gatekeeper of the resource wars underpinning great power politics.